Hans von Spakovsky is a Republican member of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Good Sunday morning. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me back.
Let me begin with this editorial this morning in the New York Times calling the commission a bogus voter fraud commission. The editorial begins with these words: "The truth cannot be repeated often enough. The Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, which held its first meeting last week, is a sham and a scam." Your response?
I really wonder why the New York Times is so opposed to actually having a commission that researches and investigates the American election process. We at the Heritage Foundation provided a printout to the members of the commission this week, and it's a database of voter fraud cases from across the country. We've reached now almost 1,100 cases. Some of them are cases in which hundreds, if not thousands, of fraudulent ballots were cast, where elections were overturned, and you have to wonder, why is it the New York Times is so opposed to taking a look at that and looking at what are the vulnerabilities in our system and how can we make it better so that everyone's eligible to vote and no one's vote is stolen through fraud or administrative errors by election officials.
Also in the New York Times this morning, an ad, a full-page ad, paid for by People for the American Way Foundation. Trump's new assault on voting rights, and includes a photograph of you and says you're the former attorney in the George W. Bush Justice Department, described as, quote, the point person for undermining the Civil Rights Division mandate to protect voting rights.
Yeah, that's to the point of being defamatory. First of all, I was a career lawyer at the Justice Department. Second, if you look at the record of the Justice Department, you'll actually find, for example, that the Bush administration filed 4 times as many cases as the Obama administration did to enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the key provision. So this idea that somehow when I was there we didn't protect voting rights it's just false.
So why the assault on this commission? Where is this coming from? What's motivating it?
Well, you really have to wonder what is it they want to hide? What is it they are so afraid of finding? I think one of the things that they don't want people to know about is the fact that, and several studies have shown this, is our voter rolls across the country are in terrible shape. There are many counties that have more individuals registered than the census shows they have citizen voting age population. We have many states where they have hundreds of thousands of individuals who are not just registered in that state, but also registered in other states. A lot of that may be mistakes and errors. Some of it may be individuals who are illegally voting in more than one state. The point is, we should take a look at what are the steps we can recommend to fix those kind of problems. And look, the commission, it's an advisory commission. It has no executive power. The only thing it can do at the end is write a report and make recommendations to the president, to Congress, to the states on what they can do to fix and improve the security of the election process.
Is it bipartisan?
It is bipartisan. There are a number of Democrats on the commission. For example, the Secretary of State of Maine, several individual county clerks, and those are the people who really know how elections are run, because elections in this country are run down at the county level. So it's a bipartisan commission, and you wouldn't believe this, I think, from reading the New York Times editorial, but at the meeting on Wednesday, there was almost complete unanimity among the commissioners on all the different issues that should be looked at to try to figure out how good is the voter registration and election process, and what can we do to recommend solutions.
One of the things, though, that the president said earlier this year when he announced that he wanted to form this commission is that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes, but had there not been fraud in the election, he would have won a majority of the vote. Do you agree with him on that?
Well, what I would tell you is we don't know how much truth there is in that. The possibility is certainly there, but we don't know. And the reason is there's never been any kind of complete, systematic, in-depth study of the voting process across the country, and particularly looking at things like, well, how many non-citizens are actually registering and voting? I can tell you right now, we have an honor system. No one in the country verifies the citizenship of individuals when they register and vote. And we have cases from all over the country in our database of non-citizens who've gotten caught registering and voting in our elections.
But you think the potential, it could be 3 million? That's a lot of people.
I don't know. There have been various studies that have looked at this. A couple of the studies range from perhaps a couple of 100,000 non-citizens voting to several million non-citizens voting. I don't know the answer to that. But the whole point of this commission is to look at issues like that and to look at other issues. I mean, one of the things we asked the states for in a letter that went out was what kind of incidents have you had in which there have been attempts to keep people out of the polls? I mean, that's another issue that should be looked at, and the commission wants to look at that.
We'll get to your calls in just a moment, but I want to get your reaction to what Jason Kander said, the former Missouri Secretary of State.
Right.
He ran for the Senate as a Democrat. He lost. He's been appointed by the Democratic Party to lead its own investigation into what you're doing. Let's get his statement.
This commission started as a way to try and legitimize, to try and justify the biggest lie that a sitting president has ever told, this commission being the Trump Commission. But it is morphed from there. And what it's become now is just a vehicle for voter suppression. And it's important for us to remember what the recent GOP history on voter suppression has been. I'm the former Secretary of State of Missouri. I was the chief election official in a state with a Republican supermajority. I've seen the GOP voter suppression playbook up close. And here's what it is. There's 3 steps to it. Step 1 is to undermine faith in American democracy so that people believe that drastic measures have to be taken. Step 2 is to put up obstacles to voting. Step 3 is to put up obstacles to those obstacles. That's how the GOP voter suppression playbook works. And what you're seeing from the Trump Commission, what I refer to as the Voter Suppression Committee to re-elect the president, what you're seeing from them is just step 1 in that process.
Democrat Jason Kander, former Missouri Secretary of State, Hans von Spakovsky, your response to what he said?
Well, almost nothing that he said is true. In particular, Kander makes this whole point that somehow this commission is going to suppress votes. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but it's an advisory commission, has no executive authority of any kind. The states in this country are the ones who run elections. The only thing the advisory committee can do is make recommendations. It's not any different than prior commissions. Everyone seems to forget that President Obama appointed a very similar commission. It was a bipartisan commission too back in 2013. It also came up with recommendations, for example, on how it said our voter registration lists across the country ought to be cleaned up. And yet there wasn't this hysterical, bizarre reaction to President Obama setting up a similar type of commission.
Let's get to your phone calls. 202-748-8000. That's our line for Democrats, and 202-748-8001 for Republicans. James is joining us from Alabama on the Republican line. Thanks for waiting. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I applaud the effort to clean up the voting registration process in the United States, but I want to bring to the discussion the idea and the fact that many of our votes are being counted in Spain by an organization called SCYTL. There is no reason, in my opinion, for us ever to outsource our vote count, and there should always be backup for the vote so that the votes counted may be reviewed for accuracy.
Well, what I would say about that, Steve, is, look, I understand the concern, particularly because of the news recently about, attempts by foreigners to hack into our systems. But the idea that our votes are being counted in Spain, that's one of those internet rumors that has been going around on the internet. I actually took a look at that. That's not the case. Votes are counted in counties all across the country. It is not outsourced to some company in Spain.
And our guest is the co-author of the book, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. What one thing did you take away in researching this book with your colleague John Fund?
That we have now for a very long time had an honor system in our election process, and that unfortunately there are people who are willing to take advantage of that. A lot of people just don't understand how close so many elections are in the country. If you go down, particularly at the county, city, and town level, we have many elections decided by a very small number of votes. And that's the key thing. The Supreme Court said in 2008 when it upheld Indiana's photo ID law, it said The U.S. has a long history of voter fraud. It's been documented by journalists and historians, and it could make the difference in a close election. And that is very clearly true.
And you're saying that a voter ID is not suppression?
The data shows it is certainly not. States such as Georgia and Indiana have had a photo ID law in place now for more than a decade. The turnout data, which I've looked at in great detail, shows that it does not keep people out of the polls. In fact, Georgia, for example, had a surge in turnout after its ID law went into effect.
Our guest is also with the Heritage Foundation. You can read his work online at heritage.org. Mavis from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Independent line, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I would like to ask the representative, seeing that he's talking about voter ID, how is it that he would allow, yes, my question is, how would the representative allow to vote with gun licenses, and you have kids who are in college and they would not accept college ID as a form of voter ID?
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. That's been brought up in the Texas ID law. I would point out that in Georgia, which does have an ID requirement, a university ID is allowed to vote. Not in Texas where a military ID, a gun license was. But there was a big reason for the difference between the laws in those two states. The difference was that in Georgia, the Georgia university system does not encourage illegal aliens to go to school there, does not provide them with in-state tuition. Texas does. A lot of people don't realize that Texas provides in-state tuition for illegal aliens. Therefore, a university ID in Texas would have been a route for people who were in the country illegally to be able to vote. That's not the case in Georgia, and that's why there was a difference between the statutes in those two states.
And there's this from Barbara. Please ask your guest, what was the result of President Obama's commission regarding the voting counting system?
Well, everyone should remember that we only had our first meeting. It was an organizational meeting in which we were talking about the scope of what the commission is going to do. One of the things that was brought up by one of the commissioners and that we are going to take a look at is the voting equipment that is used throughout the country, and the issue of cybersecurity was brought up, and that would include looking at what kind of protection are the states putting in for the computers and the software that are used to count the votes.
And with President Obama's commission, anything come from that, his inquiry into this?
Well, for example, I don't have the list of all the recommendations, but President Obama's commission, they didn't really look at the cybersecurity issue. They did make recommendations on how the voter roll should be cleaned up, and one of the things they did recommend was online voter registration, and the majority of states now have put that in.
Our guest is Hans von Spakovsky. He is with the Heritage Foundation. He's a graduate of MIT, earned his law degree from Vanderbilt University, and we'll go to Guy joining us from Gwynn Oak, Maryland. Good morning on the Democrats line.
Hey, how you doing? I just have a couple of questions. One is, how long has this commission been in place? And two is, what is President Trump expecting to find? I mean, it seems to me that because he disagrees with the popular vote, I don't see how that's going to make the commission find anything different than they haven't been finding already. And
we'll get a response. Thank you.
The commission's only been in existence for a short time. The president signed an executive order in May. The first meeting was this past Wednesday. As I said, it was an organizational meeting to determine what the commission is going to look at. And look, we're going into this with an open mind. All the commissioners have said that, the Democratic and Republican commissioners, and we're going to take a look at the entire election process throughout the country, from the time people register to the vote, to the day they go in to vote, to the vote counting that goes on after Election Day, and take a look at what kind of security issues are there. Are people being kept out of the polls? What can we recommend to actually make the process easier, smoother, but also still secure?
Let me read to you, this is from Time Magazine, The Secret History of Election 2016, Massimo Calabrese. as it looks at the other part of the equation, which is Russia. But I want to just read the first sentence to get your reaction, because he writes, Riverside County, California DA Michael Hestrin was at his desk on June 7th of last year when the calls started coming in. It was the day of the California presidential primary, and upset voters wanted the county's top prosecutor to know that they had been prevented from casting their ballots. There were people calling our office and filling complaints saying that they had tried to vote and that their registration had been changed unbeknownst to them, says Hestrin. Soon there were more than 20 reports of trouble. A 19-year veteran of the Office of Stanford Law School dispatched investigators to county polling places to see what was going on. And what they're saying is that that was one sign of Russia trying to actually get people off the rolls to cast their ballots, and could have been, although it turned out not to be the case, a precursor to a Russian plan in November. Will you look at that as well?
Yes. I mean, one of the issues that is certainly of concern to me is the fact that with states going to online voter registration, which is, look, it's a good idea. It's to make registration easier and more convenient. But when you have online registration, obviously, you're then having an online portal that hackers could potentially use to get into the system. And I'm very concerned about seeing what steps are the states taking to protect against that kind of cyber hacking and to make sure that doesn't happen. I would say, though, that anyone who wasn't allowed to vote because of some kind of voter registration issue, the local election officials were not following the law. Because under federal law, anyone who goes into a polling place, if they say, I'm registered, I'm eligible to vote, has to be given a provisional ballot and allowed to vote. So if they weren't allowed to vote, the local folks, the local election officials in California were not actually following federal law.
Let's go to Greg, joining us from Jacksonville, Florida, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Spakovsky. Good morning. I know that I've seen him on C-SPAN before.
We'll get his name correct. It's Hans von Spakovsky from Heritage Foundation. Good morning.
Spakovsky, I apologize.
That's okay.
Let me give you some quick bona fides on my viewership with C-SPAN. I'm in my 38th year of watching C-SPAN, beginning from Brian, Susan Swain, Chuck Todd, and I remember, Steve, when you were actually a rookie on the program. So I go back and I say that because of the objectivity that I've seen from C-SPAN for 38 years to give you the true news and then allow the caller to call in to give their opinion about what you're reporting in the news. So all of these criticisms that you were getting on the first part of the program, that you're slanted here and you're slanted there, my comment as a 38-year watcher is that you're very balanced to give every political party, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, a chance to give their opinion.
Greg, we thank you for that. We approve that message.
Well, I agree. I agree with that too.
Okay, so let me go into this, Mr. Spakovsky. Again, I've seen you on the program before, maybe a year or so ago or 2 years ago, but I want to talk about why you're there today. And I'm reading, Steve, from a study by older law professor, found out out of 1 billion votes cast in all American elections between 2000 and 2014, there were only 31 known cases of impersonation fraud. Now, I know that also the committee is charged with looking at other forms of voting fraud. But I think all of us, with all due respect to Mr. Spakovsky, again, I mispronounced his name, is because you're trying to suppress the vote. You're not looking into voter suppression from the legislatures of North Carolina, Georgia, or Texas. And the reason for that, again, is because you're very slanted in trying to suppress the vote of minorities and other people of color. Steve, you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work. Thanks a lot.
Greg, thanks for the call from Jacksonville.
Well, Greg, I'm sorry, but that's just wrong. If you go to the database the Heritage Foundation has put up, you will find almost 1,100 proven cases of voter fraud. These are cases in which individuals were convicted in a court of law of committing election fraud, or judges overturned elections because of fraud in the election. So voter fraud is real. There are a lot of cases of it, unfortunately, across the country. The idea that voter ID suppresses the votes, well, the American people don't agree with you. The polling shows consistently that Americans of all races, ethnicities, and political parties, a majority of them agree that voter ID is a common sense requirement. And again, look at the turnout data in the states that have had ID laws in place now for more than a decade. You will see that it did not keep individuals out of the polls. If it had in Georgia, whose law has been in place for 10 years, there would have been a lawsuit, and courts would have found against the state. That hasn't happened, and that tells you that Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, others, everybody has an ID, and every state that has put in an ID law like this has put in a requirement that a free ID will be provided to anyone who doesn't have one. And the turnout data shows it doesn't keep people out of the polls.
Let me go back to this morning's New York Times editorial, again
Sure.
calling it the bogus voter fraud commission. And it writes the following: if the commission were serious about improving conditions in elections, it would focus on real problems afflicting voter and registration, like aging voting machines, hour-long lines at the polls, and cyber attacks by hostile nations. Instead, it plans to rely on tools like the Interstate Cross-Check System, a notoriously inaccurate anti-fraud data program championed by Chris Kobach, the Commission's vice chair and crusader-in-chief. The cross-check program, writes the New York Times, compares voter rolls to identify people who register and vote in multiple states, but for every actual double voter, it finds it returns 200 false positives.
Well, obviously, the editorial writers of the New York Times did not watch our commission meeting. If they had, the issues that they talk about in their editorial, aging voting equipment, that issue came up, and we said we wanted to find out from the states what kind of equipment they're using, at what point they are in the life cycle. That issue was brought up. The commission's going to look at it. Cybersecurity, the New York Times talks about. We talked about that at great length at our meeting and said that the commission is going to investigate that. So it's pretty clear that the editorial writers of the New York Times didn't actually watch what happened at our commission meeting.
On the Republican line, Tom, you're next. Humble, Texas. Good morning.
Yeah, I thought I never missed Bush. I bet you $20 you can't name 20 people who are doing time for voter fraud. And whose heritage are you talking about? Thank you.
Well, I can name almost 1,000 individuals who were convicted in a court of law of committing election fraud. They are in our database. Every one of those cases is listed there. So the idea that there aren't people in jail for committing fraud, I'm sorry, sir, but factually you're just wrong.
Let's go to John, Philadelphia. Good morning, on our line for Democrats.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Sure.
My question is that this election with Trump and Clinton was 3 million votes. She won by 3 million votes. And then I think back now, the Electoral Commission had chosen our president. Now you go back to Al Gore and George Bush, and that was a 800 vote count there. And was that an electoral vote that made the whole difference of that presidency? And then when you say 20 or 30 votes as fraud, or that doesn't seem to make much of a difference when a lot of these people who were elected win by hundreds of thousands votes or 50,000, depending on the level of election you're going for.
Well, what I would say to that is, first of all, there are literally hundreds of elections across the country that are decided by one vote or a very small number of votes. You talk about the 2000 election where the presidential election was really decided by about 800 votes in Florida. I think it was the New York Daily Post or the New York Daily News some years ago actually did a study in which they compared the voter registration list in New York with the voter registration list in Florida. They found hundreds of people who were registered in both states, and the possibility was that people were perhaps illegally voting in both states. It doesn't take a lot of fraud to change the outcome potentially of an election. I'll give you another just quick example. There was a study released just a little while ago that found that over 5,000 individuals have been removed from the voter rolls in Virginia because they were not U.S. citizens. Many of them had voted in prior elections. I think altogether they'd cast over 7,000 ballots. The state of Virginia has had 2 attorney general races decided in a little more than the last decade by less than 1,000 votes. That shows you how important it is that we have clean voter registration lists, that we make sure everybody who's eligible is able to vote, but that we have good, accurate lists and make sure that people who aren't eligible to vote, like non-citizens, are casting ballots.
So let me go through the bullet points that you are looking for: the individual's full name, address, date of birth, the last 4 digits of their social security number. Why that, by the way?
In 2002, the Help America Vote Act, which is a federal law, required all the states to collect the last 4 digits of people's social security numbers when they register to vote. The reason for that is to prevent false positives. In other words, if you're comparing voter registration lists from, say, Maryland and Virginia to find people who might be registered in both states, if you use the name and birth date, you may end up with, for example, a number of John Smiths with the same birth date who are not the same person. But if you've got the last 4 digits of the social security number, then you know you're actually identifying the same person and not different people. So it helps you make sure you've got a good, clean list.
Also, the political party affiliation, the list of elections voted since 2006, whether or not there have been any felony convictions, whether the registrant is registered to vote in other states, had lived overseas, and also military status.
Well, one of the things we wanted to look at was the disenfranchisement rate of overseas military voters. That, unfortunately, is the highest rate of people who don't get to vote. That's one of the things we want to look at. Voter history is important because, look, if somebody's registered in more than one state, it may just be an error. You know, they moved, they didn't notify the prior state. But if you look at voter history and it turns out that they have been voting in both states, well, then you know there was intentional wrongdoing going on. And I'll give you a quick example of that. You may recall a couple of years ago there was a woman running for Congress in Maryland named, I think, Wendy Rosen. She was forced out of the Democratic congressional primary because some opposition research was done on her, and what did they find? She was registered to vote in both Florida and Maryland and had voted in multiple elections in both states. She was forced out of the race and eventually pled guilty to voter fraud.
When will the commission come up with its final recommendations?
The president has said he wanted a report and recommendations next year. So it's probably going to take us at least 6 months, I would think, to have our different meetings across the country, allowing people to testify and to collect the data. And then it'll take time to, process that and come up with our recommendations. So probably 6 months to a year.
And let me put one issue on the table. If
Sure.
the commission is recommending that states need to do a better job with voting booths, would there be federal dollars to pay for upgraded equipment?
Well, that is a good question. And in fact, one of our commissioners, a Democratic commissioner who runs elections in the largest county in Alabama, in fact, brought up that very issue. And that has been a problem for many years, county governments not getting enough money for the election process for voting equipment. And obviously that would be an issue we'll look at.
Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation and a member of the commission looking at voter integrity. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks
We
for having
appreciate
me.
it.